Hello, everyone, to History Matters, and so does coffee. I always look enthusiastic at that part because it really always does matter. Oh, it's the
newbie mug because of the bird map.
The newbie mug. So today we're talking about cruelty as politics. Oops, let me close chat. Otherwise, I will be too engaged with you guys. We're talking about cruelty as politics, and I'm going to do this without making much commentary on contemporary politics. That's going to be tricky, and I'm going to do it because I have a larger point that I would like to make, and that is never my goal here. My goal is to have you to think well about what's going on now. But before we segue to my topic, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will tell us the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. Delighted to be with you guys every Friday. And if you are new to our chat, I noticed my friend Emily is here this morning. I'm not sure if Emily has joined us before, but continue to engage in the chat. We love that. That's how our community sort of got built. But if you have questions for Joanne specifically that you'd like answered later, please put your questions in the Q&A. We have a bingo card every week. The bingo link has been put in the chat, which is kind of a fun way to follow along as well. And if you're new and you like what you hear and you want to come back, we also have a Slack community. So every week, if you're new, we just ask you to put Slack in all caps and then your name and your email that you prefer. And our lovely friend Reese will add you into the Slack community. I think that covers all the bases, John, unless you have any announcements. I know your proposals for NCHE conference are due on the 26th, so that's right around the corner. And the Equity Summit is coming up on the 24th. So those are two big events that NCHE is sponsoring.
Excellent.
All right,
okay,
we're good. Excellent. Take it away, Joanne.
I will indeed. So yes, so put your questions in Q&A. And also, I will say, we are always happy to learn of people who are new to this community that has been going for more than 2 years straight. So if you're new, just mention it in chat because you will be welcomed by the History Matters community. You'll be taken in. And it is a community, I will say. Okay, now with that lovely warm sentiment, I'm going to talk about something less lovely and warm, but important to talk about. And as I said earlier, and as I tweeted about, cruelty as politics, which is a topic that obviously was sparked by some things that are happening in the news, particularly in Texas and Florida. And as I said a few minutes ago, my goal here is not to talk about immigration policy per se. It is to talk about modes of engaging in politics that are clearly performative. So I'm not talking about policies good or bad, as I may are, but I am talking about policies that seem cruel and that in a sense are cruel, and the cruelty is part of the point. And they're very performative. They're not just a statement of policy. They're making a point in the way that they're being performed. In a sense, they're a kind of advertisement, right? That you do something and it's so outrageous or obviously out of the ordinary or by many standards, cruel, that it gets a lot of attention. And despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact, that people on the opposite side of whoever's doing this act get upset, that sometimes is part of the game, part of the aim of the politicians involved. And I've talked about that before, right? Many times I've said that if something happens and it immediately provokes an emotional reaction, pause for a moment and consider the fact that that's precisely why that action was made or that statement was made. And before you respond, I'm not telling you not to, but before you do, consider why something was done. So in some of the cases of actions of cruelty as politics, they are to provoke a response in people on the opposite side and to make a statement sometimes to people on the opposite side and to, as we say all too often these days, drum up the base, right? Get people to see that you're out there enforcing whatever policy it is you claim to be enforcing, and you're doing it assertively, and you're doing it aggressively, and you're sort of chest beating as you're doing it, right? That there's a way in which one might claim, depending on one's politics, that a person engaging in that kind of performative, cruel politics is in one way or another advertising him or herself as a leader. This is going to be an interesting episode for me to do, because I really do not want to comment on contemporary politics. I have very strong views about many things, including the underlying topic of what sparked today's discussion. But what I'm more interested as ever in discussing is in the past, how we've seen this work, ways in which that sheds light on what's happening in the present, and then related to that, ways in which you, in watching what's going on, can think about the deeper meaning of what's going on and get past the performance. So that's what I want to talk about today. And there's two particular kinds of performative cruelty that I want to discuss. They're not exactly identical to what we're seeing now with Texas and with Florida. I'll circle back to them at the end, but they do have a similar component, which is they're both really obviously meant to be cruel or humiliating in some way towards someone, right? So, I mean, some of what we're seeing now with migrants being bused different places, sent on planes, different places, and kind of moved around like luggage, right? Not seemingly not being told exactly what's happening. That in some of these cases as well, part of the point is not treating the people who are the victims of these cruel acts as though they're people. I'm going to come back to that at the end too. But the first thing that sprung to mind for me when I thought of this topic, which I suppose won't be odd, is tarring and feathering. Tarring and feathering. Now, I do want to offer a few facts about tarring and feathering, because I will acknowledge that even I myself had some things that I assumed about it that aren't necessarily true. The main point of tarring and feathering, and for those of you who have not heard of this practice before, it really is a largely 18th century, middle and late 18th century act that took place particularly in the Revolutionary era on the part of colonists towards loyalists or people who were leaning in that direction. Wasn't invented in America, was British tradition as well, and was not only in New England. It took place in different areas and continued in one form or another afterwards, but it's most famous as something that happened in the Revolutionary era. And what it meant was that you had tar was put on your body, and then feathers were put on top of the tar. And obviously it was humiliating. Sometimes you were literally run out of town, tarred and feathered on a log, right? It was a public spectacle. That was the point of it. Now, many people assume, and I will acknowledge that at some point in the past I did too, until people came forward and said, not necessarily. The tar that was being used is not, in many cases, is not what one might assume tar is. And by that, I mean, in your mind, probably in contemporary terms, tar is like asphalt, and it's, scathing hot, and it goes on your body and pulls your, burns off your skin, and it's a horrible, torturous thing. Apparently, the tar that was used in tarring and feathering was pine tar, which still is hot, but not to the point of skinning people, still hurt, still caused pain. The whole thing was still humiliating. So it's not that it wasn't in some way torturous, but it wasn't aimed at killing and maiming. It was aimed at humiliating. That was the goal of tarring and feathering, which it did, right? It did that quite well. What a spectacle that would be. That's the purpose of it. Apparently, colonial tarring and feathering for a while was more focused on smuggling in one way or another, happened a lot port side. And there's an article, I always try and offer you some sense of where I went to look. There's an article, which I do not know how easy it will be for you to find because it's an academic article, but it's by Benjamin Irvin. IRVIN, called Tar, Feathers, and the Enemies of American Liberties, 1768 to 1776, in the New England Quarterly. And he did an in-depth study, it's from 2003, of tarring and feathering and what it really entailed and what it was and what it meant. The main point is, as I suggested a moment ago, it was cruel, right? I mean, despite the fact that the tar being used is not quite as horrific as the tar we might imagine, it is still cruel, it is still painful, and it is very public, and it is very humiliating. That was the point. It was, on the one hand, supposed to embarrass the victim, but equally, if not more important, was the message that that kind of behavior sent, right? So if you see that happen, if you have similar thoughts about politics or whatever the issue is that's causing the tarring and feathering, and you feel similarly to the victim, that's certainly going to convince you to not pipe up or not step forward in a way that might earn you that same kind of treatment. And it's also a statement that the people doing the tarring and feathering are sort of demonstrating, what do the kids call it these days, flexing, are showing off the way in which they have sort of popular power, the way in which they're showing to their base the kind of, not necessarily power they have, but public ownership, right? They're declaring a kind of public ownership of the public sphere, and they're making a very public statement. So it's kind of a statement of a boastful kind of a statement on the part of the people doing it, and an attempt to humiliate and maybe even dehumanize the victims of tarring and feathering. They're actually, apparently, and I looked at Ben Irvin's article and another article, but as ever, could not go in depth here. But according to them, there are no examples of people in revolutionary America who died from being tarred and feathered, which gets back to my point, which in a way makes it more interesting and more subtle. It's not about wounding physically, it's about humiliation and a kind of chest beating, right? We have power and we are doing this thing, and these people will never do again what they're doing now, and look at us sort of controlling the public sphere, making a point about our virtue and our rightness, right? That kind of power public move in some way or another could be seen, certainly at the time, as people boasting about the way in which they're enforcing some kind of standard. That's what tarring and feathering is about. The other thing that came to mind for me, not as famous, and actually comes from my last book, and these literally were the first two things that popped into my mind when I considered this topic. So tarring and feathering is an obvious one. This one is less obvious, but it stayed with me. So someone who was pretty much my number one congressional fighter, Henry Wise of Virginia, my most frequent fighter, I guess is what I normally call him, who was not, he was a sophisticated man in a sense. He goes on to become governor of Virginia, so he's not like some back alley brawler, even though he's fighting physically and otherwise, and he's certainly a major bully throughout his time in Congress. He did what he did, and I'll talk about this one case that relates to what I'm talking about, and then I'll talk about the response, because the response is significant. He did what he did because he knew it would have an impact on an audience, and he knew that part of the audience that he really wanted to appeal to liked it, right? So in this one instance that came to mind for me, I remember, and I don't have the year, but it's probably in the late 1830s or early 1840s, I would say. He came across a specific instance of this, and apparently he did it more than once. He would, and he was notorious. I mean, he would, roll up his sleeves and punch someone. He threatened duels and duel challenges. I mean, he was in your face. What he would do apparently was announce in some way or another, not necessarily in the house, on the floor of the house, but in some way public enough that people would know, something along the lines of, this Thursday in the House, I've got something to say to Mr. So-and-so of whatever state, basically announcing that he was going to attack someone. He was going to let someone have it. And that isn't necessarily physical, but still, there was going to be a confrontation of some kind, and he would advertise it in advance, and people would pack the galleries to see, right? What's going to happen? He told us he was going to do this. And more often than not, he would humiliate the person in some way or another, and the galleries would be there. And more often than not, what would happen in generally these kinds of cases where something happened on the floor is the galleries erupt in noise, and the sergeant at arms gets upset, and there's a little to-do, and some people are escorted out. But one way or another, it has an impact. And then, sometimes at least, it's going to get some kind of publicity, if not in newspapers, certainly through other means, because Henry Wise's constituents knew precisely what he did. They knew this and other instances in which he was explicitly being cruel, humiliating towards others, simply to show that he could do it, that he had the power to do it, that he could do it without a penalty. Right? That's part of what we're talking about here too. If you can do these kinds of actions and assume you're not going to pay a price, and I won't go off onto a riff about accountability, but boy, I could talk about that every week if I wanted to, because that's at the core of so many things we've talked about here. But at any rate, if you believe you can engage in that kind of behavior with no real accountability, and the assumption that you're going to get some praise, and that people who are going to critique you in critiquing you are going to make your supporters even happier because they're pointing out what a big shot you are, right? There's accountability either comes from in an official form or isn't there at all. If you think your constituents support what you're doing, whatever cruel act it is, they support it, and people criticizing you or having an emotional response is kind of what you want, right? There's no accountability, and being told you're a bad guy is, for some cases, for some people, precisely what they want. Look at me. I'm a strong guy. I can do this thing. I'm not going to pay a price for it because I'm powerful. They don't dare punish me. And look at me fighting for you, right? That's the message. Now, in the case of Henry Wise, luckily for me as a historian, at one point, and I might, at this point, after more than 2 years, odds are I've mentioned something before and I don't know. And so I'm going to go move ahead anyway. But in this particular instance with Henry Wise, at one point, someone stands up in the House and says, not necessarily right after one of these episodes, but in relation to this kind of behavior, stands up in the House and says, you ought to be thrown out of this body. You ought to be banished. We ought to be thrown out of the Senate. You do this all the time. You don't deserve to be here. And it would be wonderful if we could censure you, if we could, one way or another, formally throw you out of Congress for this kind of behavior. It's against the rules, obviously. It's rude, it's abrasive, it's pandering to an audience. It's violent, it's everything you can think of, right? They're saying, Henry Wise, you deserve to be thrown out of this body. You don't deserve to be here. Now, Henry Wise, this is the part that makes me as a historian happy, responds to that. Henry Wise stands up and says, you know what? Try throwing me out. Do it. Throw me out of the body, because you know what's going to happen? I'm going to get reelected and put right back into the House. You know why? My constituents want me to do this. They applaud when I do this. They know I'm fighting for them when I do this. He doesn't say this, but basically he gets fan mail, right? From people saying, excellent. He even gets on occasion letters from people saying, you know what, it would be great if you attacked this person, right? He's like a go-to guy for this kind of behavior. And he rightfully says, this is great for me. This behavior, my constituents know I'm fighting for them. They know I'm standing up for their interests, and they like it, I know for a fact, because they keep reelecting me. And in an age when I always refer to them as, one-term wonders, very, very unlike the present, many members of Congress would serve one term and then almost sometimes vanish from the public record, right? It's not like now where it becomes a career choice. So in this age of one-term wonders, when people would have a term in Congress and then be gone, he's reelected 6 times, right? So he's absolutely right. He's known for this behavior. He does it constantly. He's reprimanded for it in the body in one way or another. And he's totally right. His constituents love it. They like the message that it sends. He's applauded for that kind of, in essence, cruel behavior, intimidating people, insulting people, humiliating people, sometimes striking people, but more often than not, doing a variety of different things to humiliate people and make them look cowardly or lesser. And his constituents thought this was great. That's a very similar kind of thing to what we're seeing now with people who are doing actions that others are saying, this is inhuman. It's treating human beings like luggage. It's cruel, right? You can think of any number of things that you can apply to this idea of putting migrants on planes and sending them places they don't know where they're going, perhaps under false pretenses. I'm not going to delve into the details here, because even this morning in my trying to understand the absolute facts of what's going on now, I saw many different stories. And so I don't, what I'm always telling you, right? Confirm, I'm going to come back to this as one of the points of what I'm talking about today, but you need to know the facts, particularly in cases like this, because part of it, the aim of it is to get a response. And so before I'm going to respond, there are all kinds of things I heard about the ongoing incidents now, about people with cameras on planes, and some of them may be true, I don't know. But if I couldn't find absolute confirmation in the time this morning that I had to prepare for this, I'm not going to say it. But what I can say is certainly some of what's happening, some of what we're seeing now is people being treated like props for a performance. And it's not the moving of migrants that I'm talking about. It's the performative component of it that I'm tying in with tarring and feathering and Henry Wise. It's the fact that on Martha's Vineyard, where I think there were 2 plane loads of people sent, Fox News was informed that these people were coming, but not local authorities, right? That's performance. That's press coverage. That's what that's about, right? So that's what we're seeing in these instances, is people using extreme behavior. Cruelty can be some of it, or nastiness, or things that deliberately cross lines. And it's the line crossing that is the goal, because it will get outrage from your opponents, which again, by some accounts, might make you look at me, I'm a strong person, and those softies on the other side, they're upset by this strong behavior, and gets you attention. And if you're playing it as, look at what a leader it makes me, it becomes an advertisement for you, despite all of the ways in which it's very obvious that this behavior is problematic, to say the least. It's a kind of commercial advertisement in the way that these people are using it. Their goal, Henry Wise's goal, isn't to hurt someone. His goal is to be seen threatening to hurt them, right? His goal is to be seen as the guy who's willing to do that and to go pretty far down the line, right? And to say really extreme things. I think at one point he says what he needs to be a good member of Congress is a good friend and a good weapon. Okay, so, granted, apparently he did always was a guy who was armed a lot, but to make that kind of statement, and a good friend meaning a second in a duel, right? That is part of what he's saying there. To make that kind of statement boldly, to the point that historians several hundred years later know that he said it, and in that case, I believe he stood up on the floor of Congress and said it. So he's making those kinds of statements. Those statements are like other obviously performative things that people are doing for the impact, to make a political statement. And their wrongness, their inhumanity is part of the point, is part of the message. So I am literally talking about cruelty as politics. Now, a couple of things, a couple of takeaways here. And actually, I should mention, I scribbled it on the back here, hadn't turned the page yet. I did tweet about this, so I won't go into detail about it, but as I said a little bit earlier, it's not as though this is an early American thing, this idea of moving people around like, chess pieces to make a point. I did tweet about, actually, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library tweeted this. I just retweeted it. About how there were, in the civil rights era, reverse freedom rides, which is what they were called, created, in which white citizens councils in the South would send Black people to the North, give them one-way tickets to northern cities with false promises of jobs and housing and better lives. Again, sort of making a spectacle, making a point, and in at least one case, sending people not to a shelter or to an organization that might be able to help them, but sending them to the home of the Deputy U.S. Attorney General in New Jersey. Just like I believe there were 2 buses of people sent to Vice President Kamala Harris's house. This is performative. This is making a statement. And the statement, is, well, this will show the Biden administration. What it'll show is that this is a person who is playing this kind of political game, right? It's not going to show an administration anything. It's not like any administration would look at that behavior and say, they're right, going to change our policy. That's not what is happening here. Cruelty is politics, misbehavior as politics, threatening, bullying as politics, which I've talked about before. Those are power plays in one way or another. They're not about actually engaging in the give and take of politics. They're not about debate. They're certainly not about compromise. They're shows of seeming strength intended at getting some people to shut up or back down, and intended to put potentially other people who are upset by it in a difficult position. So what do you do? So a few things I want to say here. I always see I'm about to run out of time. I always like to end these conversations, at least a few takeaways about what this realization or what this fact might teach. So I have a couple here that I want to mention in thinking about this. Number one, and I've already mentioned it, when you're seeing this kind of performative cruelty, get the facts, right? As with everything else aimed at getting particularly an emotional response, where you want to respond, where you are having a strong emotional response, and I will acknowledge I was, even this morning, get the facts. Because if you can confirm what's happening, then you can decide how you want to respond. But responding to things that are being rumored, not only does that send you off in a direction that doesn't help you any, but it makes you look, or just generally your side look uninformed or triggered, right? If you're going to respond strongly, respond with facts. As ever, confirm, particularly in cases like this, specifically what is happening. Second, once you have those facts, then you really need to evaluate motives, intents, I-N-T-E-N-T-S, not intents, although that too, and publicity or the lack thereof, right? That you need to, once you have a sense of exactly what happened, then you can begin to consider, what were these people aiming to do? What is the goal? What did they deliberately put in place? And what does that suggest to you? You can only begin to really understand motives and purpose and impact if you really corral the actual facts as best you can about what happened. Third, which in a sense is obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway, when people tell you who they are, believe them. When they show you who they are, believe them. If you're seeing facts, if you're confirming things are happening in reality with provable facts, and people are advertising that behavior, which you know for a fact happened, and it's behavior that clearly, deliberately crosses lines, particularly in respect to other people, that's a statement. of many kinds. And one of the things that that states is what this person or a group of people are willing to do to other people. Believe people when they show you that, when they tell you that. If they're willing to behave that way and advertise it, that's a strong statement, not necessarily of a kind that they want their followers to get, but it's a strong statement of precisely who they are. Believe them. And that doesn't mean, I'm not even telling you how to respond with that belief. I'm simply saying that kind of behavior advertised and boasted about, whatever it is, in whatever capacity, cruelty as performance, that makes a very strong statement about who people are, and what they're willing to do. And, in this case, they're boasting about it. It suggests what they're willing to do. I went and looked actually, and decided not to go fully down this path, but in short, if you are routinely dehumanizing people, sort of not treating them as human beings in any way, that's one great signal that you're on the road to authoritarianism, right? When some people don't count as people, they just don't count. Think about all of these things when you are seeing cruelty as politics, but always, always first get the facts, because those kinds of incidents, that kind of behavior, it's vitally important to understand what's happening for all kinds of reasons. Confirm the facts as best you can, and then respond. Okay. I beat the mug calls. Wow, I did. Okay, so I struggled a little today to figure out what mug to pick. And I think this one, I think it will be apparent what this one is about. It's from a conference I did, I think maybe my first or second year in grad school. I've used it before, like I said, I'm kind of running out of mugs. It's telling about the South. Telling about the South, which I was thinking of by, the reverse freedom rides is what led me to this. White citizens commissions finding ways to send people elsewhere without their necessarily knowing. So that's pretty close. It's as close as I could come. I think I talked about Thomas Jefferson when I was at this conference, so I didn't necessarily talk about the same thing, but at any rate, this is today's still related. Like, I'm still hanging on there, guys. I'm still coming up with things that are pretty related. So I give it some effort.
I think that's a good mug. And as usual, I've taken a ton of notes.
Oh, okay.
And we have some great questions. So are you ready for a few questions?
I am ready.
All right, take a sip out of that awesome mug. All right, the first one is making me laugh. It says, Julia, still in Connecticut. She says, were tar and feathering was an evolution from the public humiliation of being put in the stocks in colonial times? Is that kind of...
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if it evolves from it, but the idea is the same. Sure. If you're put in the stocks, I mean, that's horrible and uncomfortable and can be damaging to you. But the huge point of that is humiliation, right? Public humiliation. And so it's the same impulse, which is it's going to hurt. There's pain involved. So it's not just humiliation, but the humiliation is a big component of what's involved. So they are related, I would say.
All right, this one comes from our friend Dave. He says, historically, who decided who was tarred and feathered? Was it an elected official like a mayor or a local council?
No, I think more often than not, I mean, I want to say mob actions, which doesn't necessarily mean, sometimes, there's a tradition in early America and in the early modern world of mobbing as politics, actually. So a certain amount of mobbing behavior was seen as a valid way of protesting. So I'm not saying that didn't happen, that people sort of got angry and like went as a mob to tar and feather someone. That could have happened. But it certainly would have been mob in the sense that it was a group of people who would have decided that someone merited this, enough of a group of people that it seemed to have approval, and that it was going to make a statement, and that these people ideally wouldn't necessarily be accountable in a bad way for what they were doing, because accountability is part of this too, right? We're looking at Henry Wise and tarring and feathering and some of what's going on now. All of these people assume they're not going to be accountable. Henry Wise even says, yeah, sure, go hold me accountable. I'll see you within a month. So they are assuming that they're going to be endorsed for this kind of behavior.
All right. This one coming from Mike. Which Speaker of the House do you think used the practice of cruelty most often in order to control the members?
Ooh, the Speaker.
Control.
I think generally speaking, no pun intended, I don't think the speakers were engaging in that kind of cruelty per se, but I would say they were being cruel in the sense that they did not necessarily come down on people who were behaving badly, right? That in some cases, a speaker would reprimand or hold responsible people from the other party and not people from his party, or would, help others, would manipulate the rules in a way that, and a speaker would, sometimes not have anything to do with it. On the other hand, I have lots of anecdotes of things happening on the floor. And actually, in one case, at least, the speaker had stepped away for a moment, and there was a speaker pro tem in the chair. And when this began happening, the actual speaker ran back because he was like, oh, whoa, wait a minute, I'm going to have to do something. So I think the position of the speaker was choreographing and sort of allowing or not allowing. And I think that's where you could say cruelty happened, would just be not endorsing rules. Now, I will say, in addition to that, it's also a fact that certainly in the congressional period that I write about, there was a certain assumption, which was more about men and gentlemanliness, or lack of gentlemanliness really, but still, that a fair fight was a fair fight. And that in some way you don't interrupt, you don't get in the way of a fair fight, which sounds a little bonkers if you're talking about the House or the Senate, but sometimes that idea would hold people back from responding. Which is why, someone like John Quincy Adams, there would be some bad thing would happen in Congress, and then it would come to a close, and then John Quincy Adams would write in his diary, and now the lamentation speeches begin, right? People would stand up, Northerners often would stand up and say, no, we need new rules, this is bad, after it happened. So the choreography of these things, in some ways, if you look at that, might help offer some examples of speakers who are decidedly not involved in whatever's going on.
When you were talking about the pro tem speaker and then everybody started misbehaving, I was having flashbacks to when we have substitutes and the kids all misbehave. Oh. kind of mentality sometimes of Congress. Sometimes they act like middle school children.
Well, because they feel no accountability, right? Isn't that true? For a substitute teacher, the teacher's probably not going to be there again, and you could do whatever you want. I mean, right. I can't say I fully remember what that felt like, because I would have been the student and not the substitute, but I would assume that's part of it, right?
Some of us have been on both ends of that. You get that angry note the next day, which is why a lot of teachers didn't call in sick even when they were. And that's one thing now post-COVID. People are like, if I'm sick, I'm staying home. All right, this one comes from our friend Gloria. She is asking, could you not say that the message of the action was to say that you should feel the effects of a policy? If the migrants are the migrants not illegal, sometimes people make decisions without feeling their effects. So I think she's
so here's one thing I would say about that. I thought about that a little bit. There were different ways of doing some of what's going on now and making this point. If a person had contacted people and said, there's a plane coming to you right now, full of migrants, sending them to you because they shouldn't all be here, that would make a strong statement, but would be more humane than what happened. That's not what happened. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that that would be right, but I am saying there are ways, if you want to protest a policy, and I don't think this is the way to do that. I think you actually can engage, you can protest in humane ways that don't involve people as chess pieces. But even that little tweak of telling people, people are coming towards you, you better get ready. People would still be mad, it would still be wrong, we would still be treating people as chess pieces, but it wouldn't be explicitly surprise dumping people without their knowledge in a place that's unprepared for them. That's like extra bonus cruelty to me. So yeah, I think there are ways, everyone has a right to protest policy. I don't necessarily think using people in that way is a valid way to do it. But even if you're going to do that, which I don't agree with or think is right, there are even ways to do that that are more humane than what appears to have happened.
Yeah. What I was most shocked at is that they were shoving those microphones in those small children's faces. And I felt like that was, it's one thing to do that to an adult, but to us, those little kids were already so frightened. That's what, anyway, I don't want to get in the middle of it.
No, I know, but that's,
that really
people to Kamala Harris's house too, right? That's like,
yeah. And knowing that she's in Washington, that's her house that she goes to maybe once every couple of months.
There's a spectrum of protest, and some protest is deliberately inhumane and cruel, and that's what I'm talking about. Is untempered, just like as cruel as you could be. Maybe you could be crueler, but still cruel to the point that people will notice. Because if this slightly less cruel mode had been taken, it would still get attention, but not the same kind of attention, right? It wouldn't make the person sending people quite seem as the, yeah, I'm in charge kind of person. It actually would seem like a protest of policy and not necessarily an assertion of someone's aggression and power, aggressive power. That's part of what the cruelty can show, if that's what you want it to show.
Yeah. All right, our good friend Richie Houston, who joins us all the time, even in person. Last year, he met up with us at OAH. Richie is asking, do you see a parallel to cruelty being used as a tool of controlling enslaved people and enforcing Jim Crow? Do the areas where this was used have a continued interest in that method, like in the modern day?
Well, I mean, I do think cruelty is a tool. I'm talking very explicitly now about politics and making very specific examples, but obviously in anything, in society, institutionally, in politics, cruelty can be a tool. It can be used to intimidate, to frighten, to silence, to control, to disempower. There's a power to cruelty. And I saw someone say, it's so sad, this lack of empathy, Cara Lee. Right. So that's the flip side of this, right? Is that you're talking about how, in a sense, how many ways cruelty can be used as a tool. One of the things that can prevent that is simple empathy with other people, right? So the prevalence of cruelty without any, not only without any sense of shame, but boasting of it, that's a distinctive moment. It's not the only moment, and as this question suggests, it's been going on forever. And certainly in the South, and I've talked about this in an earlier period, in early-ish America, the South as a slavery-based society is a society grounded on violence. It just is. And the way that you show mastery in every sense of the word and power as a man in that society, among the ways you can, is to be a good slaveholder, meaning you have control over the people who are working your plantation. So if you are in a society that is grounded on slavery, grounded on violence, it certainly is going to have an impact. Even Thomas Jefferson says this in Notes on the State of Virginia, right? Slavery teaches people to be a certain way. It changes your character, white people, and has an impact on who they are. So where he's deeply conflicted on slavery, so we're not going to go there, but he does acknowledge this point. And so I do think the South has a tradition, there's violence all over the place, but the Southern traditions of violence are shaped, at least in part, by traditions having to do with race and slavery. I think I've said this before, right? Northerners tend to be more about riots because there are cities and they're denser populated. So when Northerners are violent more often, that's what they're doing is rioting. You know, in the South, there's more man-to-man combat. That's where the dueling is happening. That's in the West is sort of, you know, rough and tumble violence. There are different kinds of violence in different kinds of places. There's a book that I used in my last book called American Mobbing. And of course, I've forgotten the name of the author.
Tim will find it. Tim will have that link.
Grimstead. His last name is Grimstead.
Okay.
And it's actually Ed Ayers has written about this too. I see his name coming up in chat, but this book by Grimstead, whose first name I have forgotten, talks about Northern and Southern styles of violence in a really interesting, a colorful way, but a really interesting way. And I found it really useful in my work. So if you're interested in that idea, I recommend that book.
Yeah, I put a couple of links to Bunk in the chat about Aretha Franklin's FBI records just getting unsealed recently.
Oh, I missed that.
And I also put a link in there about Colin Kaepernick, mainly so I wouldn't forget what I was thinking. But, you know, a lot of times, you know, because Richie's question also asked about the Jim Crow era. And I think about people like Aretha Franklin and Billie Holiday who harassed because they made political statements on stage when they were performing, or, you know, when Billie Holiday sang Strange Fruit and they would plant drugs or, you know, capitalize on her addiction issues when she was trying to stay clean. And I don't know if anybody else has read those FBI files for Aretha, but I found that article very fascinating. And then the way that Kaepernick was bullied out of the NFL for taking a stand just makes me think it's not just politics, but it's also corporate America. It's also caving into the politics.
Oh, it's definitely not just politics.
No, and yeah, the record labels threatening them that they're going to lose their contract. No. So students,
but that gets us into a slightly different thing too, which I don't want to discuss now, which is cancellation.
Oh yeah,
that's something maybe on another occasion we could talk about. But it is true that however you define cruelty, it's not just political, but that's what I was talking about today, because politics, democratic politics, is so centered on appealing to an audience in one way or another, right? And so part of what you're seeing in the deployment of cruelty in this way is manipulating democracy, using cruelty to manipulate a democratic politics. You know, I've said it several times already that the things that make a democratic politics distinctive and special and potentially engaged with the populace more so than other kinds of government are also vulnerabilities. If it matters, if public opinion matters as profoundly as it does in a democracy, the ways in which you can manipulate public opinion can be dangerous depending on that manipulation, right? So democracies are good because we have a voice. Our will is supposed to matter. But that means demagogues or people who pander to the public or lies or cruelty or any number of other things can shape public sentiment in ways that may be more centered on a politician or a group of people than they are on the general good, to say the least.
Yeah. Okay, we have a couple more questions.
David Grimstead, look at that. Of course, you guys are, and a review even. You guys are, why did I, you know, as a matter of fact, when I cited Ben Irvin's article on tarring and feathering, I was like, yeah, you guys are like, in a nanosecond, you find anything I refer to.
I kind of feel like we have our own archivists in the chat.
I know, it's totally true.
So if I need something, I'm not going to Google it anymore. I'm just going to wait for Tim to put it in the chat. Oh my gosh. Okay, this one comes from our friend Sandra Peters. She says, Joanne, was this cruelty as politics more a Southern phenomenon? She's trying to understand how, if this bloodlusting intersect with Southern outrage and honor performativeness.
Well, so in the period that I wrote about, yes. Well, let me complicate that a bit, because I'm a historian. That's what I do. I complicate things. And this was part of what inspired my working on the book, is what I was curious about is a version of this question, which is what happens in a political institution, a body, when you have people from around the Union with different ideas of lawfulness and manhood, and what's right and what's wrong and how they should behave. But if you put them together and then I have to talk about contentious issues. And part of what I found was in that climate, the Southerners were, not all, but many, were much more willing and ready to engage in threatening behavior or violent behavior than Northerners. Doesn't mean that Northerners were better behaved. As I said, they preferred rioting to man-to-man combat. But in Congress, your willingness to be violent man-to-man on the part of the Southerners gave them an advantage. And so in Congress, that's the case. And actually the book I mentioned, the Grimstead book, goes into this quite a bit because it's about American mobbing and it looks North and South, and it does not say this is all Southern, but it's different. The character of it is different. So, I would say the South being a slave society, I would say honor culture, right? The dueling culture, the sort of general idea that you need to maintain your reputation with displays of strength, which again is tied to slavery. That's how you show that you're in control. There are reasons for the kind of violence and the kind of cruelty ethic that comes out of the South, and some of it is just grounded on race and the history of race in the South. But that's not, it's not the only place that has cruelty. It just, there's a Southern flavor to it, I guess is what I would say, more than anything else.
All right, this is our last one.
Oh, okay.
Ryan, I can't believe it. This one comes from Ryan Harvey, and I'm not sure if I've seen Ryan Harvey in the chat. So Ryan, if you're new, let us know.
I want to know people.
Do you know Ryan? I that's a new name to me, but I could be, maybe Ryan's been with us all along and I just didn't know. Okay, Ryan asks, how can we hold them accountable other than
no, he's been here for years.
Oh gosh, well, how have I not?
We apologize, although you're still very welcome.
I know, we love it. I just feel bad. Oh, you're just quiet. Okay. Well, Ryan, don't be quiet anymore because you have great questions.
And welcome. Yes.
Okay, so he asked, how can we hold them accountable other than voting? I don't live in Florida or Texas, but I believe them and maybe even their states should be held accountable. And Ryan, I don't know if you're a male or female, Ryan. I shouldn't assume anything. Okay. Well, so other than voting, how do we hold them accountable?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of ways. An obvious one, if you don't like what's going on now in either Texas or Florida, you're not a constituent of these people. So yes, if you contact people, your voice won't matter so much and your vote is not going to affect them. But you can still contact your member of Congress. You can still contact them. You can still make your voice heard. And we saw with a while back when healthcare was up for debate and everyone sort of spilled out and contacted their members of Congress, and then there was a response. One of the things that I've thought for recent years, this is not pandemic, but even pre-pandemic, is I don't think Americans realize the degree to which getting together and having a strong voice about something can actually have an impact. And we see it sometimes with people coming out against a brand or something. And I'm not actually talking about cancel culture. I'm talking about, how can this brand do this? And then the brand backs away, or they change what they've been doing, or they hide what they've been doing. That public opinion, again, getting us back to democracy, public opinion can really have an impact if you are loud enough and you're willing not just to individually to voice what you think, which matters, but even better, to be in a group of people, to have a lot of voices step forward and say that you object. Even if your vote doesn't count against the people who you want to protest against, if there's an understanding that there's widespread dislike, detestation, whatever you fill in the word, of something that's happening, that matters, right? I mean, think about right now the sort of general idea that that some on the right are getting, that generally speaking, Americans do not like the overturning of Roe, right? That's a general sense of public sentiment. And what are we seeing? We're seeing people, some people running for office erasing from their websites their view on abortion. We're seeing people back a little bit away from what they said, not necessarily from what they're going to do, but that's an impact of a sort of general idea about what the public thinks. So part of my answer to this question is making noise, being heard, and speaking up, even if your vote doesn't count. That matters. It matters if you're loud about what you think. It matters if you get others with you to be loud about what you think. It matters if you get other people with louder voices to be loud. It matters. And I know it's so tempting to think, well, no, it doesn't matter. Like, how do I matter in all of this? There's nothing I can do. And I profoundly don't believe that. Even at the point that we're at, I think we matter. I think what we say and what we do matters. And I think it matters more than we realize. And I'm going to continue to say that. It's part of what drives me to do everything that I'm doing, webcasts, podcasts, op-eds. It's part of what drives me is my profound, sincere belief that what we do and what we think matters in this moment. It really does. If we think it doesn't, we've already surrendered. And I'm not going to surrender. And I'm ideally not going to let anyone out there surrender either, right? I think that fighting with loud voices, standing up and being heard again and again and again, protesting, it matters a lot. And I think that even with this cruelty that we're seeing, and even though that's hardly satisfying, is to say, like, I'm going to speak up against what's going on. I think being loud, I think organizing on a local level, I think getting together with other people who agree with you to act together on a local level, all of that stuff can matter. Historically speaking, when you look at activism that has a real power, more often than not, it's ground up. It's not top down. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing often that some on the right have been organizing in a way that really has a power to it now. We're seeing it. They've been focused on state level and local level politics. And you can see the fruit that that's bearing and the power of that. So that's important. It's important to remember that. It's important to act on that. You've gotten me on my soapbox, man. I'm sorry. But
absolutely not.
I feel very passionately about this. And I don't want any of us to surrender or give up.
Yeah. So my friend Emily is joining us today. And Emily, I don't know, is this your first time coming to History Matters? Emily lives outside Annapolis. And she's an awesome mom and teacher. But I put in the chat a lesson that we did about John Lewis, that last essay he wrote the week before he passed away. I don't know if you remember, the New York Times was told not to publish it till after he was gone, and he passed away like 5 days later.
Wow.
But that, to me, when I have a bad day, like in the work that we're doing, like you were saying, that's what makes you do everything you do. When I'm having a bad day, sometimes I just go listen to the audio recording off the New York Times website of John Lewis's last letter.
Did you post that?
I did. I posted the link to the learning resource because it also includes a graphic novel about his life, and also Martin Luther King.
Resources, newamericanhistory.org. Good Trouble. Of course that is.
Yeah. That essay, they have a version of it where Morgan Freeman reads it. I really wish Representative Lewis had recorded his own voice, but it's such a poignant letter. And if you've never read those comics.
But that's
someone got to Morgan.
That's wonderful.
Just, it inspires me. He's always inspired me, but especially that last letter he wrote was pretty wonderful. Okay, well, we've exhausted all the questions. I can't believe it.
And it's 2 minutes after. So
I know it's a record.
Segue to what comes next. So if there are folks who are here who are new, we are now going to segue to the after party. What that means is that we will stop recording so that we can be a little freer and easier in our conversation and talk about whatever it is that we want to talk about. And if you have beamed in through the NCHE website, all you need to do is stay right here and you will instantly, poof, be in the after party. Someone just got bingo. If you are on Facebook, if you are watching from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us through ncheteach.org/conversations, and that will take you into the after party. As we sort of beam out of here, I want to thank you as ever for showing up on a Friday morning to engage in the conversation of democracy, for us to have conversations, for us to, as a community, come together and think about and evaluate what's going on around us, and to use history as a guide in doing that evaluating. I will also never give in to anyone who says humanities have no meaning or no power. Harumph is what I say to that. And every Friday morning, we show the ways in which history has so much to tell and help us in the present. There's so much there. So at any rate, thank you for engaging in democracy on a Friday morning. I hope that everyone has there's even a emoji poof symbol now. Someone just made one, Cece.
Oh, it's the fireworks one. That's a good one.
I like
it.
It is a good one. I hope I will see all of you and more next Friday, and have a good week. Until then, you guys are still, man, you're clicking away there, adding all kinds of stuff. I saved this chat like crazy for that reason, and Annie saves it too, so that you can.
I save it and we archive it over on our Slack channel and our Weekly.
There we go.
Okay. Let us know when the recording's done and the Facebook's off. I did put the bird migration map link in there, Joanne. Here, I'll put